you mentioned the CCP keeping hostages, American citizens hostage. Can you give an example or two of that so our viewers understand what's at stake here?
Yeah, I forget the names, but 3 or 4 years ago, there was a woman and I think two children, all U.S. citizens, who were being detained in China because the husband, also a U.S. citizen, was involved in a commercial dispute in some province. So that's been going on for quite some time. And this whole issue of exit bans. This brings up the case, of course, of the two Michaels, who are the two Canadians who were detained after Canada, at our request, detained Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei Technologies, because of her violations of US law. So China just grabbed the two Michaels, Michael Korvig and Michael Spavor. So yeah, China does this. And we should not be permitting our citizens to stay in China to be potential hostages.
I believe the State Department does still currently advise against Americans going to China. But, you talk about the Chinese Communist Party, wanting to destroy the United States, but Xi Jinping talks constantly about a shared future for all mankind. What does he mean by that?
By shared future, he means Chinese rule. He has been trying to impose China's imperial era system, where Chinese emperors believed that they not only had the mandate of heaven to rule what they called Tianxia, but that heaven actually compelled them to do so. And so, there have been a number of figures in history who have believed that they should be the world's only legitimate ruler. But Xi Jinping has gone one step further, because in 2017, his officials started publicly talking about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory. So he's the most ambitious aggressor in history. Now, that means the United States, at best, is a Chinese colony. It's not a sovereign state. And to put a point on this, in May 2019, People's Daily, the most authoritative source in China, issued a landmark editorial that declared a quote-unquote people's war on us. We're Americans, so we think we have every right in the world to ignore what our enemies say about us. But people's war is a phrase that has great meaning in Communist Party thought. And if we were under any doubt, last year, PLA Daily, which is the official website of the Chinese military, defined people's war as, quote, total war. So we're on notice. This is a fight for the survival of the United States. And in that fight, we have to take extraordinary measures, even if it means disadvantaging Americans and others who want Chinese consular services in the city of New York.
Well, what are some of those extreme measures that you would suggest? Because I often hear one of the criticisms of putting tariffs on Chinese goods is that it would hurt the American GDP, it would hurt your average American consumers who have to pay more for basic goods and services.
Yeah, we have a lot of smart people in New York and Washington who just were up in arms over the tariffs that President Trump imposed in 2018 under his authority under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. People have done surveys and studies of who actually paid for those tariffs. And I think it's pretty well settled that somewhere between 75 to 81% of those tariffs were actually absorbed by China itself. So Americans paid, a small portion of that. Let's remember, though, what those tariffs were for. Those tariffs were remedy for the theft of U.S. intellectual property, and each year China steals hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. IP. People put that at around $500 billion a year. So we've obviously got to do something. I mean, I think at this point, whatever we do will have a cost for the American public. But after decades of truly misguided China policy, we cannot think we can escape this without cost. And we're going to have to bear costs. But I believe that we need to do something because China's trade policies are increasingly predatory and criminal, and we've got to impose costs. This is a struggle. A lot of people say, Trump started a trade war in 2018. No, that's wrong. China started a trade war decades before, and Trump had the temerity to fight back. So we have to fight back. And this is going to be ugly. But unfortunately, That's where you are when you had these just bad China policies for so long.
So, other than tariffs, what would you suggest a Trump administration do?
First thing, I think that we should enforce the Tariff Act of 1930 as amplified by the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act of 2021. The Tariff Act of 1930 says no product which is made with forced labor may enter the United States. Well, we know that many, many products of China are made with forced or slave labor. And even worse, it's the forced and slave labor of racial minorities in China, the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, and the other Turkic minorities. So we should not allow these products into the US. And by the way, that means almost every green product of China, like solar panels, are made with Uyghur forced labor. So, just enforce US law. But I believe that we should be encouraging American businesses to leave China. We should be forcing Chinese business out of our country. Another example of enforcing the law. China has been running Chinese gangs have become the world's #1 money launderers. Well, they do that through New York, through dollars. Every dollar that clears in the city of New York. We didn't allow Pablo Escobar to launder money through New York. So why are we allowing the Chinese to do that? Enforce the law. If we declare these Chinese banks to be a primary money laundering concern under Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act, they will no longer be able to trade in dollars. And that means we can put these banks out of business, at least outside of China. That includes all of China's big 4 banks. And people are going to complain and they're going to howl. But the point is, nobody gets to violate US law, especially not a country which has considered us to be an enemy. Let me cool
Now
down.
you mentioned,
Good.
Gordon, you mentioned that the Chinese Communist Party has been able to handle hostile presidents before Trump. Like, what were some of the ways that they do that? And do you think the Trump administration will be susceptible to that, or have they kind of learned from their first go around?
Yeah, the last American president who was overtly hostile to China was perhaps Eisenhower. But of course, you had George W. Bush come into office with positions that the Chinese abhorred. Now, what happened is George W. Bush, in the war on terror, decided to enlist China's help, which was misguided, to say the least, because China was supporting the Taliban. And China got us to detain Uyghurs in Guantanamo, which was horrific. So, they handled George W. Bush masterfully. They got George W. Bush to criticize Chen Shui-bian. Remember when Wen Jiabao came to the Oval Office and George W. Bush admonished the leader of Taiwan? This was really, really bad American foreign policy. But the Chinese were masterful. They controlled George W. Bush. This was not to our credit. Oh, and by the way, it's the same George W. Bush who offered a ransom to the Chinese to get our aviators, the EP-3 incident on April 1st, 2001. George W. Bush allowed the Chinese to take apart that plane, steal all the electronics, hold our aviators, and we even offered a ransom to the Chinese to get them out. That's a low point in American foreign policy.
I think we're going to have a lot of moments of trying to cool down in this discussion.
Sorry, yeah,
it's been bad for a long time. No, this is good because this is the problem. They've been walking all over us for a long time, and very little has been done. We recently did an episode on that House Oversight Committee report that looked at all of the ways China was attacking the U.S. and how federal agencies are doing essentially nothing to respond. So people should get angry.
One of the important things is that we had the American people in this election cycle get angry. You had people in the flyover states. You had people in, even on the coasts who'd been ignored by the elites. And the reason why Trump won was because these folks just decided that they had had enough. And so they voted. And the reason why Trump won was not because of his base. Yeah, he held his base, but it's because he won a large portion of the independents. Like me, I'm an independent. I'm not a Republican or Democrat. But that's the reason why Trump took this election. And I hope that he responds to that, because we need someone to defend our country. Trump started that in his first term, which is the reason why, going back to the 2020 election cycle, Beijing worked very hard to make sure that he did not get reelected. But this is a critical point in our country's history, because we have just had an administration, the Biden one, that allowed China to do so many things that were very dangerous to our country. And we can't permit that going forward.